Welcome everybody to this presentation about the art of the necessary, effective management of API landscapes. My name is Erik Wilde and my main goal of this presentation is to tell you a little bit from my experience going into large organizations, seeing how they're using APIs, seeing what kind of guidance they put around APIs, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that maybe require a little bit more, let's say, attention if you want to get the most out of APIs. And I think in the end, that's what we all want. So let's move forward and let's look at, first off, the motivation for all of this. So why are organizations nowadays looking at APIs? Oftentimes it's in the context of digital transformation, the idea that you want to take your organization, transform it to use more digital capabilities, to become better at using digital capabilities. And by doing that, on the one hand, you better adapt to the increasing digital environment that we have in our world, but you also adapt to the speed at which things develop nowadays. And that is one of the other important factors of digital transformation. It's not just making sure that you can do things in a digital way. It's also making sure that you can adapt quickly, that you can build new value chains, that you can react to changing environments and so forth. And that is necessary because nowadays, more than ever before, we have a lot of technology. Technology changes rapidly. It's something that we always need to monitor, we need to adapt to. It's something where many people have expectations that certain devices are supported, certain things are supported. The other thing that also evolves constantly is experiences and expectations also evolve over time. This picture is, it's me almost getting run over by a robot. Well, not quite. As you can see, this guy is a pretty small one. But it was pretty funny. It was when I lived in Berkeley, they had this company, it's called KiwiBot. And the KiwiBots were really roaming around campus and on nearby roads. And the idea of KiwiBot was to build a food delivery system. I don't think it ever really worked all that well. They got stuck, they got lost, they got stolen. And it was something where you could tell it's very early and it's probably a little bit too early to really expect that a KiwiBot will bring you your food reliably. A friend of mine ordered once and I think it arrived after 45 minutes, and basically also only because somebody from the company came and rescued the robot and then actually brought the food. But the point being that these things evolve, they evolve quicker and quicker, and it means that you have to build new ways of how you can deliver experiences, how you can make customers, people satisfied so that they will choose your offering over others. And I think that is really the pressure that drives all of this, all of the digital transformation space, not just into digitalization, but also into this idea of speed. It needs to be something that can constantly adapt, constantly react to changes. And for doing that, you have to have those parts in place that you can constantly rearrange, add new parts, switch things out. For example, change the delivery model of your food supplier, so now that you can also use robots and these kind of things. And what we see there is really this idea that these digital landscapes that we're building and that we try to exist in as an organization, they grow and evolve. And we are part of it, so we also need to grow and evolve, which means we have to expose everything that we do in a digital way. It also means that everything that we build also has to be built in a digital way. That's something that a lot of people nowadays refer to as API first, meaning that anything that you develop must be available through an API, because then you can utilize it in the digital world. If it doesn't have an API, it's kind of almost useless. It's not really accessible in a digital way. And when you do that, when you adapt to this digital world where you say the things I develop also become part of this digital world, and I know that I will have to do this faster and faster and faster, that also means that the business side needs to leverage this, and the business side needs to come along and take advantage of it. And for example, be more exploratory than businesses used to be. Try out more things, learn quickly and say, okay, let's try this and this and this, whichever works best, we'll go that way. So you look at mechanisms such as A/B testing, where you just deploy, for example, different versions of the same service, let's say the same website, and then you observe what happens, and whatever you think works better based on real-world metrics is then the solution that you choose, and say, okay, we're going with A or we're going with B, because that seems to be better in terms of fulfilling the metrics that we have defined. And if you do this kind of exploratory value chain design, so to speak, another important thing to also take in there is that it's not just you now doing this exploration, but you also pull in others. For example, we can go back to this delivery model again. You could say that if you're in, let's say, the business of supplying food, you want to be able to partner with delivery services, so that, for example, if then there is something like this robot that roams the streets of inner cities, that it's easy for you to say, okay, let's use this as another way of how we can deliver food. Let's see how it works. Let's see how people like it. Let's see how well it's adopted. And if it works well, then you keep doing it. And if nobody seems to be interested, or your, let's say, experience with that service is not great, then you stop doing it. Right? But this is really this idea of a platform business model where you say, I'm doing some things that I am good at, and I'm partnering with others where I know that others are good at it, let's say delivery. And then I can provide an experience to my customers that creates the best overall experience, because they get my good food, they get it delivered quickly, and then everybody's happy, so to speak. And when you look at what happens there, and I think that is really the kind of the deep lesson in all of this, it means that this idea that an organization does something just by itself, this idea is increasingly going away. To some extent, you could say that has happened for many decades now, because large organizations always have had supply chains and so forth, and that is true. But that was different because that was kind of just the back end. So the idea was, yes, we are using a supply chain, let's say, to acquire certain parts, because we can get these parts cheaper when we get them from a supplier than by making them ourselves. And we can't differentiate ourselves when we use our own parts. So let's use the cheapest ones we can find that have the quality that we need. But that's different from a platform business where you are counting on others to co-create value with you in ways that you are not able to do. So there is a qualitative and big difference between, let's say, a car manufacturer having parts being supplied by others, where these parts are kind of replaceable, and you could say, well, they choose wherever they can find the cheapest part at a given quality level. But that's very different, let's say, from a food company having their food delivered by delivery services, where this is not something they could reasonably do. And they can depend on others, let's say, to come up with new delivery mechanisms and so forth. And it's not a space that they play in. They play in the food space. But it's something that overall creates a much better experience for the customers. And that's the fundamental difference there. It's that this co-creation of value is something where an organization takes value that is relevant, but that this organization is not in the market for basically to create, but they want to deliver it. And that's this co-creation mechanism. And when we look at this, what this takes us to is the logical conclusion that this old model of, and I have a picture here of one of the greatest German castles, that this old model of building one integrated, beautifully integrated, highly optimized system that does its one job very well, and then you just keep it running, and that's all you need to do to have a working system. This model is increasingly going away. And we can see that nowadays, for example, with car manufacturers. Right? They used to be these manufacturers that had this model of coming up with a car model, designing it, then building a production line to actually build it, then build it 1,000,000 times, and then go through the same process 6 years later with rolling out the next model. They tweaked this by going with a platform model, which means something else in the car business, right? But this idea that you can build different cars on the same platform. But over time now they're seeing that just building the best car, just being this machinery that churns out great engineered cars is not good enough anymore. What you need to do nowadays is you need services around it. Let's say things such as people can have packages delivered to their trunk, or they want to be guided to the next charging station. They want to have an easy way to find out when to service certain aspects of their car. And these can be things that oftentimes can be best accomplished with partners, because even as a very, very large car manufacturer, you cannot do all these things. So you have to learn to move away, at least in part, from this idea of building a highly integrated system, and then you move to more like a market model where you say we supply certain parts of what we do as a company, and then others supply other parts, and overall we deliver a great experience to our customers. But the way how this experience is composed is not such an integrated way anymore. It's more a decentralized way where we can mix and match things, and we can pull in co-created value from others and so forth. And that allows us to more quickly adapt to changes in the market, changes in the competition, requests made by customers and so forth. And this is really where successful organizations nowadays differentiate themselves. This ability to move away from being this highly integrated castle to this more organically growing and evolving ecosystem of a market. And if you do that, what you can see, and there's many, many fascinating parallels with nature, right, is that if you go with this more decentralized model where things are not as integrated, this allows you to be more optimized for resilience and change. And we always have these stories of these highly optimized things that work well doing one thing, and then if something changes, the whole thing collapses, right? Because it can't keep up with the demands to change, and it's optimized to do one thing. And we have all these stories from companies, right, that collapsed under their own weight, even though they were very good at what they were doing. But when that changed, they were not able to adapt fast enough. And that is, I think, really the main factor here. What we're trying to accomplish is build a system that has this ability to adapt. We're not doing this because it's fun, and we're also not just doing it because we want those parts to be more digital nowadays. We also do it because we need to change what the overall organization is doing, because we know that we will have to change constantly from now on, and the demands for change will only grow faster. There's one fascinating thing that I like to quote. It's called Conway's Law. It's named after Mel Conway. And his observation is that he said, if you're an organization that's organized in a certain way, what you're building is a reflection of how your organization is working. It's a reflection of the communication structures of your organization. And the reason for that is that building complex things requires a lot of teamwork, a lot of communication. And depending on how the communication lines work, that is how the design will end up, because this is the kind of the best way to build something when you use your communication lines. Right? So if you have a very hierarchical, highly integrated organization, you end up with a highly integrated system. And when you turn this around and you think about, now what do I need to do when I want this more resilient and more decentralized system? Then you end up with a logical conclusion where you say, in order to even be able to build that, I have to change my organization. I have to give more autonomy to all the different units that are building individual capabilities, so that my communication structure in my organization has this decentralized and more loosely coupled property. And then I can build something that has the same structure, that is also loosely coupled and is decentralized. And this is, after all this introduction, I think this is where things get really interesting. Because when we look at how software engineering works nowadays, we still build the individual components, I would say, in roughly the same way. Of course, I mean, we have developed all kinds of things that make it better. We'll look at that in a minute. But it's still this idea that these components, we start from, we want to build something that does certain things, and then how do we get to building that so that it works given all the requirements that we have, that we define as these are the properties that it needs to have. But what I think has fundamentally changed, or needs to fundamentally change, and hasn't really changed everywhere, is how do we assemble these components now into working compositions? And I think this is where we've actually seen a much bigger shift that doesn't really manifest itself quite as much in specific technologies, like we maybe see more directly at the engineering level of smaller components. And sometimes in large organizations, and that is my observation, I think you still have quite a bit of this mindset of let's compose our system out of these components in a rather integrated way. And I think then when you do this, then you kind of do not use one of the really important bits of APIs, which are the ability to pull things apart so that you can then have this decentralized model. So if you don't do this, then you're using APIs on a technical level, but you're not utilizing them to, let's say, realize the most value that you could. And when we look at how this is done nowadays, then, for example, microservices are a good pattern where it becomes clear that just using APIs isn't good enough. Right? Using them in a certain way, for example, self-contained, individually deployable components, that's a good idea. And making sure that everything that I build has an API, that's a good idea too. And when we look at these things, what I think is the interesting observation here is that there are these two concepts of programming in the small and programming in the large. And programming in the small also has changed, right? We have Agile nowadays, which uses more feedback. We have DevOps, which means that you can't just declare victory and walk away from something that you've built. We also have test-driven development and other practices like this that make us better at understanding what are we even building, what are the requirements, well, the tests. But I think what is also an important change there is how programming in the large changed. And I think that has had even more impact, so to speak, but it's harder to pin down. I think that's kind of the problem sometimes. Because if we think about what we do with programming in the large, what we build is more this ecosystem, and boundaries between organizations nowadays are even fuzzy, right? It becomes a question of who do I partner with? What can they do for me? What can I do for them? Maybe maybe either it's something that I want to insource or it's something where I kind of can find a partner. So it becomes something where even the boundary of an organization becomes kind of context dependent. It also means that I need to be able to change quickly. That is really important. I think that often has not enough importance when you look at what people are kind of highlighting in their architecture diagrams. And I think it's something where you can also look at how engineering and technology should not be something that I build into my architecture. Right? These are the things that I should be able to change easily without having to redo everything. And I think that is really where we'll get to in terms of looking at what is necessary for me in this programming in the large architecture, and what are constraints that I could define, but they wouldn't really create any value. The opposite actually would be true. And when we look at what we just discussed, the point I want to make is sometimes, and I've had that several times, when you talk to IT departments in large organizations and you talk about APIs, you get this mindset where people say, we've been doing that for decades, right? APIs is old wine in new bottles. And of course, at the technical level, that's true. APIs as communication mechanisms between different programs have been around since the 1940s, since the first computers existed. Network APIs for communicating components across computer boundaries have been around since the 1950s, since the first very basic computer networks existed. So yes, we've been doing that for over half a century. But the point of APIs really is not so much that it's new to have applications talk to each other. The point of APIs, as we should look at them nowadays, is that they allow us to align business and technology. The request that we have when we're using APIs in a good way is to say we should see these APIs as communication channels that are aligned with the communication channels in our organization, because then we can build and evolve these systems more quickly, and that will give us the advantages in speed, resilience, changeability that we're looking for. And that, to me, is really the main message of APIs. It's not so much, APIs, it's something new. It's really this idea of we need to look at how do we build better systems. And I think one of the lessons really is from this idea of moving from integrated to decentralized systems. And in order to do that, what we want to do is really build this marketplace in the end, where we say, and in more technical terms, we can call it a platform. That's what we usually do. Where we say, as an organization, the way that we want to set ourselves up with our IT system is that we have a set of things that we do, our assets and capabilities. We have the ability to pull in what others do, our partners or the public. That's the value co-creation, right? Where companies such as Uber and Airbnb are just masters at this. And then out of this, we create experiences for users that are valuable, where users like what we're doing, and then we're successful. And that, I think, is really the main message here that APIs should allow us to do. And what's important here is really that it's not just that there are APIs in there somewhere. It's important that the APIs are aligned with what we want to do. So it's APIs for co-creation, it's APIs for exposing valuable capabilities and assets, and it's APIs for delivering that value to customers. And when we're good at that, then we can make this platform model very effective, and we can change it easily. And then the question is, how can we be good at that? Now let's look at this. So the API journey, that's what I like to call it. The API journey starts with understanding what do we even want to get out of APIs. And that's exactly what I was just talking about, that we want to get more out of APIs than just saying, oh, we connect it to software components, right? That's not value, that's just a technical thing. So when we look at what we want to get out of APIs, we have to be clear that what the API should allow us to do is to align our business with our technology and make sure that the way all of this functions is reflected in the organization. And then we have this model where we can use APIs as an effective mechanism how to build a decentralized and evolving system. Now, how can we get to actually do that? The strategy is defining the goals. What do we want to get out of APIs? The way how we are getting to these goals is we use an API program. So an API program is an initiative that you have that helps with this process towards a more API enabled and a more API focused idea of how you turn this integrated castle into the decentralized marketplace. Right? And that often means you have to do evangelizing and explaining why this is important. You have to help teams how to do this. So you have to do trainings, you have to talk about API design, you have to talk about API management, you have to talk about API security, you have to talk about what are success criteria for an API, KPIs for APIs. And while you're doing that, you also constantly need to look at your program and say, are we still on track? If yes, great. If not, what do we need to adjust so that we can be more successful with our program? Once this program gets in motion, what it starts is building up this platform. This platform that teams can build on. They can use existing APIs. They can use tooling to create whatever components they want to create. And then they can expose these components as APIs and part of the platform. So that is how your platform is constantly growing, by having, so to speak, a starter set and then having everything that is built on top of it becoming part of the platform itself. And by this, you have this healthy and living and growing platform that you want to have. And that is really the magic, basically, of this API platform cycle, that once it gets going, it has a momentum to it, because whatever then gets built on it becomes part of it, which means you can now build more on it because it's more powerful, more encompassing of the kinds of things you can do with it, and then you can build more on it and so forth. And the things you build on the platform are individual products. Are these things where you start thinking of how you can deliver value, and then you can build that based on the platform. And by doing this, you have to implement some things. You have to write code, and then you have to expose an API as part of doing that. And this is really where this whole story has headed. Now, how can we make sure that writing this code becomes as effective as possible? And we can make sure that it becomes as effective as possible when we allow people who are writing the code as much autonomy as possible. And that is really the important part here. And this is the balance between two kinds of teams. There is a platform team, which kind of manages the platform, manages tooling around it, manages some operational aspects of those, and also comes up with guidelines, for example, to say, why do we think APIs maybe should look a certain way? And then there's a product team, and of those there are many. And these are building the individual capabilities. So they build on top of the platform, and ideally they just use it and they are happy about how it works. If they're not happy about how it works, if they feel they are lacking support or they are unduly constrained, then they should be able to raise issues and say, we don't think the platform is as good as it could be. Here is how we think it could be made better. And that then again goes back to the platform team as input that they hopefully will use. And this is how this whole cycle actually works. You have the platform, which is constantly evolving. You have teams working on products, providing feedback about the platform, and then the platform can keep evolving. And as part of that, what you often have are API guidelines. API guidelines are a set of practices in organizations where you say, this is how we build API products. This is how, when we build something as a digital component, this is what teams should be doing, must do. There are different levels of, so to speak, compliance. One of the things that I often see in organizations happening is that the guidelines are way too heavy because people writing them assume that they want to put everything in there that they can. And that is the one big message that I have for you today. Don't put everything in there that you can. Only put in there what you have to do. Where you think that if that is not part of the guidelines, that would be bad. That would create some side effects that would be bad for the overall value of the API ecosystem that I'm creating, and therefore there should be some guidance around it. If you look at your guidelines this way, then you can evolve them over time. You can start with 0 pretty much, and then add things and say, oh, we don't want this to happen, so this is something that should go into the guidelines. And then this is something where you constrain teams as little as you can. Right? You discover things where you say, this is necessary that we all do this in a disciplined way. And for the other things, teams get more freedom. And again, this is exactly what microservices have done. Where in microservices, for example, you tell teams, well, if you want to pick a certain programming language, if you want to pick a certain database, technology maybe, go for it. If that allows you to build your product more quickly, that's fine. And maybe you have to manage that a little bit so that you don't have 1,000 different languages and databases running. But it's something where you can definitely nowadays, with a lot of automation technology that's around, you can give teams more autonomy than you were able, let's say, 10 years ago. Right? And I think that's a very good thing, but that's still something that I think sometimes people need to kind of appreciate and make part of their practice. And in order to do that, I think it's also a very good idea whenever you have these guidelines to think about, what am I even putting in my guidelines? So why does a guideline exist? And go through this in a structured way. Why does a guideline exist? What does the guideline do? So after I know why it exists, I say, here is what should be done about it. And then how can somebody put this in practice? And one of the things that's really important, I think, is guideline management. It's not just having guidelines, but being able to evolve them. And being able to evolve them means allow others to participate and have a process how you manage their participation so that they can make suggestions and then somebody looks at them and then they get accepted or not. And it's important so that the guidelines actually become this living document that everybody sees, reflects current practice. And if the current practice changes, then the guidelines change accordingly, right? It should be this way around, not we change the guidelines to change the practice. No. We change the practice because we learned something, and then we change the guidelines to reflect the practice. And Google has this really interesting, I think, model, which is called Google API Improvement Proposals, AIP. And the interesting part there is that these are, in effect, Google's API guidelines, but an important and large part of it actually is also the process around it. So how do these guidelines change? And what I'm showing you here, and I'm linking it from the graphic to the article, and you can also, of course, you can Google for the Google guidelines, is this the state changes basically. The one thing that I'm missing in here a little bit is that it doesn't have a simple way for how an improved guideline can just be retracted or deprecated or something like this. I think that hopefully is also part of it. But apart from that, I think it's something that shows you clearly how much thought to some extent they have put into managing their guidelines over time. And one of the things that I like to say, because people always like look at me with a little shocked, right? It's like, I think when you really want to go in this direction that we discussed today, embrace the chaos is a good spirit. It's this idea of I cannot constrain everything, because then I'm back to this old school way of building this one perfectly engineered integrated machine that can never change because it does one thing, right? So don't do that. Think of what you're building as many different pieces that are in play, and your job as an enterprise architect in that case is to make this landscape effective, to make it valuable. And the more you allow these different bits and pieces in it to evolve independently, and you just constrain them as much as you have to, the more, and I firmly believe this, the more you are able to build a productive ecosystem of components. And I think we will only see the space becoming faster, choices becoming more plentiful, because it's just more and more things are getting digitalized. So this space will not slow down, I think that's for sure. And because of this, I think it is really important to think about how do we manage this going forward? And I think the way to manage this is to really try to step back as much as we can and try to only regulate and constrain those things that we have to. And that is a shift in mindset. I think in particular, when you talk to kind of dyed-in-the-wool enterprise architects, when they get asked to, you're not the grand master of planning anymore, instead you're kind of more becoming the landscaper, that, sometimes it's also a question of ego. And, this is not how we've done it. And like a lot of being challenged at a very fundamental level. And I think that is something that often also causes not technical problems, but organizational problems, human problems. But I think it is something that we've seen over and over, and I'm a firm believer that we will see more of it. It's only to come. So in conclusion, what I would like to tell you is what you can take away from this presentation is if you remove constraints, what you do, I think, is you create potential because you open up the space of possibilities. As a platform team, keep in mind, only constrain what you must, not what you can't. Try to be disciplined with those constraints, separating the what from the how, so that people can come up with creative new solutions to problems that you've identified. And also make sure that everybody can participate in improving this guidance so that over time your landscape can evolve. If you're in a product team, be sure that you provide feedback about the platform that you're building on. What works for you, what doesn't? What kind of tooling do you think would be useful? This is extremely valuable input for the platform team, and I think it is important that everybody in that space sees themselves as part of a bigger team in the organization that tries to make this landscape, this platform, as good as possible. So as long as you do this, I think it becomes something where everybody is pushing towards the same goal to maximize the overall value of the platform. You're just doing it in a different way from how it was done back then when planning, where it's more done top down. And I think the different way that I just described, I think it's the better way going forward for most of our problems we have ahead of us. Of course, it's still, and I won't spend any time with this, right? It's still different, of course, when you're building a spaceship, right? If you're building a spaceship that needs to be built and then it gets sent to space and it needs to function for 30 years, you're building that in a very different way from building Uber. But that's not very many of us are building spaceships. Most of us are building systems that have a little looser constraints around them And I think it's time that we reflect that also in the way how we're building things. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to look at the slides online, you can find them at the URI that you can see here. If you want to follow me, please, well, you're welcome to do so. I love getting feedback. You can find my information here about my Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And connect. Let me know what you think. And that was it. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.